let's now move on with building our description section. And so this is where we left off. And the first thing that I want to do is to simply format these paragraphs. But they actually don't need much formatting. All we want to do here is to give them a little margin to the bottom. Okay, so let's do that. And I would like to copy this here. So paragraph. And since we're doing that, let me also put the list here and also the recommend. All right, so paragraph. And actually all we want is to give them a margin at the bottom because the last one shouldn't have any. And so we can do that. We did it a lot of times before, so not the last child. And that's actually it. So when we have multiple paragraphs, we want them to have a margin at the bottom, but not the last one. Okay, and so that's what we have here. And so here we go. Well, actually it has a margin here, this last one, and that's actually because it's not the last child of this container. So what we should put here instead is last of type. And so now there are only 2 paragraphs, and the last one of them will not have the margin. Okay, and so now the margin is gone here. All right, so last child applies to all of the children of the current element, while last of type applies only to all of the same type of element. Okay, and now our list. So let's take a look at how it looks like. So it has this margin here on top and at the bottom, and it also has this gray line again. Okay, and then it has 4 of these items on each side and also this small icon here. But that's the last thing that we're going to take care of. Okay, so let's start with these lines and by putting them here side by side. So list, we wanted to have a margin at the top and the bottom of 3 rem and 0, of course, on the side. And well, the first thing actually is we don't want it to have any list style. So these small bullets are gone. Okay, so that is the margin. And then we also want some inner white space. So padding 3 rem as well. And now we want the border. And actually border top and border bottom. All right. And now here we can use the variable that we defined before. So very simple. Instead of having it to write out all again, it's now as simple as that. Okay, let's take a look at that. So that's a lot better already. So we gave it some white space here inside, so padding, then the border, and then the margin to create the margin here and down here as well. Now next up, we want to put these elements here side by side, right? So what we're going to do here is once again to use flexbox. So display flex. So how is that going to look like? Well, it simply tries to cram all of these elements beside one another. But there's actually not really enough space here, right? So this really looks kind of terrible. But we have a solution for that, remember? So what we can say is flex wrap and then allow these elements to wrap to new lines. So all we have to say is wrap, and then this is going to happen like this. It's still not perfect, of course, but you see here that we have one element here, then it finishes, and then the next one starts, and then it finishes, and the next one starts. We can actually take a look at that in the inspector. And so here you see how these elements are now side by side, but in different lines, in different rows. Now there's actually an easy fix for that, right? Can you think of how we can fix this? Well, all we have to do really is to give each of these list items a fixed width, right? And then like that, they will all look the same because they will all have the same width. So let's actually do that. And so it's our list item. And again, we're not using the width property here, but instead the flex. So don't grow, don't shrink, and the width should be 50%. And why is that? Well, it's because we want to have 2 elements side by side. And so 100% of width divided by 2 gives us 50%. So let's check it. And yeah, so this is what we want, right? We can actually inspect it, and now we see that each of these has the same width, which is exactly 50% of the container, so of the Flex container of all of these elements. All right, so this was the first time that we used Flex wrap here, and I hope you see how useful it can be in a real life situation here. Okay, so now let's just give these a small margin at the bottom, like 7 pixels, so 0.7 rem. And then after that, all that's really left to do is to add these icons here, right? So these ones here. So this icon here is actually one of our SVG icons, right? Now this time I don't want to use them in HTML because I don't want to have to use like 8 SVG elements in the HTML and then mess around with all that. So instead, what I'm going to do is to use this icon right in CSS, okay? Now in CSS, it's really difficult to use a sprite image like we did in the HTML, remember? So this sprite file here, which has all of our icons, is what we used in HTML. But here in CSS, it's actually much easier to use the single icon itself. And since we're only using one icon here, so one SVG file, it's really no difference to include just the icon itself or just the sprite image, because we're only using one icon anyway. So the one that we want is called the chevron right, okay? And it comes here from this folder that we copied here, okay? So it's this chevron thin right.svg. So I copied it in here so that we can use it directly from this folder, and then we can delete actually this SVG folder because we don't need this anymore. Actually, let's look at the code here of our sprite file. Because remember that I said that SVG is basically just a way to write vector icons or any vector image in code, okay? And so this is the code for all of our 10 icons. All right, so I don't want to go deep into this. I just wanted to show you that it is indeed code and a lot of numbers, as you can see. All right, so how do we actually include an SVG file in our CSS? Well, it's very similar to just any other regular image. So the easiest way is to use a background image. So let's do that. And we are going to do that in a before pseudo element, okay? So item before. So basically, before each of these item elements, we create a small pseudo element, which then will have this background image. And that's a better and cleaner practice than putting it directly here on the item. Okay, so we use background image to include the icon. And now we actually have to go up one level, right? Because we're in the Sass file or in the CSS file. So technically we're going to be in the CSS file because that's where the compiled file lives, right? So we are in the CSS folder, then we have to move up one level to the main project folder and then go into IMG and chevron thin right. So IMG, and now for some reason it's not recognizing the path, so I have to write it out here, thin right SVG. I hope that's correct. Yeah, it looks so. Now this is the easiest way, and well, it's not really working. And yeah, of course it's not, because remember, we always have to specify the content property. So setting it to empty. And also, since we're at it, let's put it as an inline block and give it a height and a width. So let's say 1 rem, or we can make it a bit bigger here actually, for starters, just to see it better what's going on. And I'm going to reduce it then later. So 2 rem, and then just a small margin on the right, like 7 pixels. Okay, so to create a margin between the icon and the text. So let's check that out now. And yeah, here we go. So these are our icons, a little bit too big, but you see that it works. So these are our before elements. So you see, here it is. Now there is actually a problem with this approach, because if we include it as a background image, then we have no way of actually changing the color. Now if that's not a problem, then we can of course go ahead and make it like this. But in our case, we really want it to be this pink color, like this, right? And so what we have to do is to use a different approach. And that approach will include masks. All right, so this here is the approach for older browsers, because the masks do only work in really modern browsers. So for older browsers, we can use the background image. And since we're at it, we should also set the background size than to cover. But for newer browsers, we use masks. Okay, so I'm going to remove this part here. And later, a little bit later in another lecture, I'm going to add a feature query saying that if the mask property is supported, then use the mask. And if not, then use the background image. Okay, but for now, let's just comment it out and do it here with the masks, because that's the best approach. Now, what is actually a mask? Well, basically a mask defines an area where we can look through the element and see what's behind that element. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is to set the background color of this element to a solid color and then use the icon as the mask. And so we can then look through that mask basically and see the background color in the area where the icon is, and everything else is covered. And so it's just going to be white. Okay, does it make sense? So let's start by adding that background color. Actually, it's missing the color part here. Okay, and so that's going to look like in that case. And so now we're going to put our mask on top of this, and only in the positions where the icon is, we will then be able to look through that mask and see that pink background color. Okay, and the rest will be covered. So it's basically a bit like clipping that we did before in the other project. So let's try that out. So right now it only works in WebKit browsers. Okay, so we have to use the WebKit prefix. So mask image. And then it's just the exact same way as before. So all we have to do is to include this file. And that's it. And then another thing that we can do is to say WebKit mask size. And that's also very similar to background size. So we can use cover here so that the icon covers the entire element. And as you will see, this is already enough to make this work. All right, here we go. So once again, this entire square that we had before is still here, this pink square, but we now can only see it in the places where the mask allows us to see through, okay? And that's exactly where the icon is located. All right, so let's now decrease this square, okay? And then it all should decrease, and that's because of the mask size property, okay? So let's check that. So without the mask size, it would look like this, because the icon is actually larger than the 1 rem here, okay? But with mask size, which behaves like background size, we can then use cover, and that fixes it. All right, and so that's a great solution to the problem that with background image, we cannot change the color in CSS. So masks can be a great tool to have in your toolset. And actually, I'm going to put it here also without the prefix. So basically for the future, when all the other browsers start implementing this as well. All right, and with that, we're actually done with the list. All right, so that's our code for the list. Again, we're going to use a feature query here later to make this part here active for the older browsers who do not support the masks. But let's leave that for later and move on now to the recommend component. So first of all, let's give it a slightly smaller font size of 1.3 rem and also another text color. So to make it a little bit lighter. So the one that I want is this one. Var. And all right. Now as for the photos, let's actually format them before we format anything else, because they're these huge looking images which are like way too big. So let's just give them a height of only 4 rem and a width of 4 rem as well, and a border radius of 50% in order to make them round. Okay, and then the other selectors that we have here are the, let's see, so we have recommend count, friends, and photo. So we have count and friends missing. Okay, so let's check that out. And here we go. So here you have the text, and it's way too light, so I'm going to change that in a second. And then you have these images. And they are, of course, on different lines, because they are both block elements. So this one here, and then this box. So they should be side by side, So let's once again get help from our friend Flexbox. Display flex. All right, and this one here should actually be dark and not light. All right, so let's take a look at that. And all right, they are side by side now already. Now these images, they are also here like on top of each other, like this, okay? So like slightly overlapping. And we can simply do that by giving them a negative right margin. So by giving like this image here, imagine a right margin, it then moves to the right in this direction, overlapping with this one. So all of them should have a negative right margin, except the last one here, because we want this one right at this side. Okay, so photo. So let's select all of them except the last one. So not the last child. So margin right minus 1.5 rem. And actually, yeah, this is what we want. Okay, that looks good, but not perfect, because here we also have this white border here. So that's just a white border that's going around of all of these images. And so that creates this effect looking like they are all on top of each other. Okay, so let's add that as well. So border 3 pixel solid and just white, because that's the background color of the container as well. All right, so here we go. Now, actually, we saw that now these images they look like they are smaller, right? Let's check that out. So this is the border, and the border actually goes into these images, right? So you see that when the border is active, the image basically shrinks, okay? And so we have now two options to fix that. We could either add these 3 pixels here on the height and the width, or we can do it automatically, okay? And let's do that automatically by using the box sizing property. Remember, we set the box sizing to all the elements to border box. And what border box does is that it includes the padding and the border into the width and the height of the element. And that's usually exactly what we want. But in this situation, it's not what we want. In this situation, we want the border to be added on top of our height and the width, okay? And so we can set it back to the default, basically. So box sizing, content box, which is the default. So if you check it out now, you see that it looks different. And so let me take out the border here. And so you see that the images stay the exact same size, right? So great. Now next up, we should probably vertically center these two elements here and then push this box here all the way to the right side. Okay, so that's pretty easy right now since we are already using Flexbox here. And so all we have to do is align items, set it to center, and then we want to create that space between them. Now, how do we do that? Well, we already did it before, and so I really hope you remember this amazing trick that I showed you and what helps us doing exactly that. So, do you remember it? Well, we just have to say margin right on the count, right? Because that's the element which holds the text. So margin right, auto, right? And that is actually it. So if you check it out now here on the count, you see with the orange color there, the margin, which was automatically calculated to push the recommend friends box all the way to the right side. So great, right? So really cool tool once again. And with that, we actually finished this section of the website. So it's now ready. Let's take a look at the original. And you see that it's exactly the same. All right. So great job once again. I hope you're getting better at Flexbox and see how all these Flexbox properties come together in different situations in order to create the layouts and components that we want. Okay, so that's it. If you want to now remove this ugly green element here, then you can just come with me right to the next lecture and create the reviews here that we want to have in this section.